on the cloud. Perfect. I think we're recording now. Great. So, all right, as I was saying, welcome everyone to our webinar, EmpoderaClima webinar on women on the front line of climate change and COVID-19. It's a pleasure to have everyone here. Let me just introduce myself before introducing the amazing speakers that we have today and introducing a little bit about EmpoderaClima if you don't know anything about it yet. So my name is Renata Alvarenga. I'm from Brazil. I have been a climate justice advocate for about 5 years now, both acting in the community level in Brazil, in Latin America, and also at the global level by attending UN climate change events like COPs, COP21, COP25. Sorry, my telephone was ringing. So I have been doing this for quite a few years, and just about a year ago, I created EmpoderaClima, which in Portuguese and Spanish stands for Empower for Climate. It's a mashup of the two words. And EmpoderaClima is all about empowering young people and young women, especially from the developing world, from the global south, to get engaged in climate action, get engaged in sustainability. So that's the general idea. I'm gonna send on the chat in a little bit for you, so you can check out the website. It's EmpoderaClima.org, or you can take a look at our Instagram page, which is at EmpoderaClima. It's very easy. And we post weekly updates of the content that we're doing on the website. And you can also check out the website after this call. The website has content such as podcasts, videos, research documents, all kinds of things on the topic of gender equality and climate action, which is our main topic here today. Our two speakers will talk about that. But after the webinar, if you want to learn more about what this is, what the relationship of women's empowerment and climate action actually is, you can definitely check out the website. And of course, we're doing this webinar in English, but we also have a lot of content in Portuguese, which is my native language from Brazil, but we also have Spanish as well to really represent the youth in Latin America and represent the global south. And of course, in the future, in the very near future, we'll be adding other languages. But for now, you can take a look at all kinds of content, including original content that we've done for the past few months on everything related to climate justice, gender justice, and climate policy. And the idea of EmpoderaClima is that it's an educational platform. So we really aim to represent youth, women, and people in the global south. So that's the idea. There's not a lot of youth groups out there that engage in this specific gender issue, the gender and climate justice issue. So this is really our effort to bring that to the global south, bring that to Latin America, and make it as accessible as we can to the people who don't have the opportunities usually to attend conferences like COP, attend conferences like the other UN climate conferences. So it's really our effort to make that more accessible to people everywhere. We have currently a group of 10 people that are working directly in research and translation. We have volunteers from Brazil, from Chile, Argentina, Ireland, the US, France, so really all over the place. And that's the idea. The idea is to be as inclusive as possible and really include as many voices as we can when we're presenting this issue and talking about this really important debate. So for those that just joined, welcome. I'm Renata. I'm introducing EmpoderaClima, who's the host of this webinar today. And then I'll pass the floor to the two amazing speakers that we have today. But moving on, basically, as I mentioned, we're almost at a 1-year anniversary for EmpoderaClima. We were launched last Earth Day, so last April 22nd. So this Wednesday, we're actually completing 1 year of many activities. So it feels like it's been a long time, but also a really short time. But in this time, we have been able to really fill the website with a lot of amazing and cool content on gender and climate action, which you can take a look, and also attend a lot of conferences back when we could have these huge public gatherings that we did last year. So EmpoderaClima was present at COP25 in Madrid, and there we hosted a UN official side event on the role of young women from the Global South for Climate Action. So everything that I'm mentioning here, you're welcome to take a look at later. We have videos on YouTube from these events, and you're definitely welcome to research more about this after we're done with this webinar. But it's really great that you're all here. You're all interested in learning more about what's the role of women, especially women from the developing world, in fighting climate change, and also in COVID-19, because we are facing this very challenging health crisis globally, and it's important that we think about the relation of that to the climate crisis, the climate emergency, and how we can bring those two together, and of course focus on solving the global health crisis and solving COVID-19 right now, but never forgetting that climate justice is something that we have to work towards in the next few years. It's very important. So it's just really crucial that we don't lose momentum when we're talking about achieving climate action and achieving sustainable development and the sustainable development goals of the UN. So that's really what EmpoderaClima is all about. I hope you guys enjoyed this webinar, and I hope you also enjoyed the website later on. After I'm done with my little introduction, I'll share on the chat the links to check out our website and our Instagram and all of that. But yeah, so this is our, as I mentioned, our first webinar of celebrating Earth Week. It's a really important week, so I hope that this webinar is useful so you can learn more about climate justice, but that you also keep that going by talking to your friends and family about the importance of gender equality for climate action and the importance of including in those discussions. Great, so, sorry, I was muted for a little bit. Let me introduce the two speakers that we have for today. The first speaker is Shannon Greene. Shannon Greene is a researcher at EmpoderaClima. She's been working with us for the past year. She was also part of the COP25 delegation that we had in Spain last year. She's a social science graduate with a master's in human rights law from Ireland. She's really passionate about the intersectional relation of gender equality, women's rights, and climate justice, and she really has a strong awareness in integrating social and ecological justice in her research. She's currently doing research on the women's participation in climate negotiations for human rights. Additionally, she has completed research in ecofeminism, how human rights of women and other marginalized groups are affected by environmental degradation. Let me just ask everyone just a little bit of applause. Everyone can mute themselves just so we don't have any background noise. That would be really awesome. Great, thanks. So continuing, so that's the bio of Shannon. In her spare time, she enjoys reading, taking long walks on the beach, and smashing the patriarchy. So thank you so much, Shannon, for being here. I know it's quite late for you. It's late in Ireland, but we really appreciate you being here and sharing your expertise on the relation of gender equality and climate action, especially during these difficult times that we're facing. And now let me introduce our second wonderful speaker that we have today. That is Tetet Nera-Lauron. Tetet is a human rights activist and climate justice campaigner based in the Philippines. Tetet is actively engaged in official processes related to the post-2015 agenda and also to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. So she's quite active also in the Gender and Women constituency of the UNFCCC, the UN Climate Change Secretariat. Currently, she's an advisor for the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation, supporting the regional programs in Southeast Asia. And previously, she has served as co-chair of the CSO Partnership for Development Effectiveness and program manager at IBAN International. So as you can see, we have two really amazing speakers that are experts in climate justice and have been doing work on it for the past few years. So Shannon's gonna tell you a little bit about the relation of environmental degradation and sustainability with women's empowerment and gender equality. And then Tetet will share a little bit more about the need for systemic change, climate justice, and also, of course, how all of that correlates to COVID-19, which is the biggest issue that we're facing today, the biggest challenge of our health crisis nowadays. But our goal here is to really try to stress how we can tie all of that in to solving the climate crisis, hopefully in the near future, because that is for sure the biggest threat that we face. So thanks again for joining. I'm gonna now pass to Shannon Greene so she can do her presentation.
Hi everyone. Thank you, Renata, for the lovely introduction. I do not have a webcam, so I apologize. You're just going to have to look at my little. Let me see if I can get the. Just going to share my screen there. Thank you. So it's really nice to see some familiar names, and especially in these times, knowledge sharing is really, really important. We're trying to look for new and innovative ways to communicate and mobilize with each other. So it's really, really great that this is happening. I have included a text version of this. I'm not sure, Renata, if you've distributed it in the chat, but just if anybody wants to look at the text version instead, if it's more accessible to you, or if you want to supplement it with the slideshow, it's got image descriptions in it as well.
I'm adding it to the chat.
Perfect. Okay, so we'll begin. This is just a very, very short introductory presentation for those who may not know a lot about the gendered impacts of climate change. So, yeah. So climate change is obviously going to have encroaching effects on everyone all over the world. However, how someone is equipped to respond to the crisis is dependent on certain inequalities that they face. So those who are marginalized because of their ethnicity, gender, their race, sexuality, nationality, among many others, they may face the longest road toward recovery. And seeing as gender equality remains a pervasive issue in the world today, and they face many cultural and social barriers, there are certain power dynamics and roles and norms that they kind of have to adhere to, which may, in times of environmental crisis, may lead them to be disproportionately impacted because of restricted access to resources, finance, land ownership, and other rights. Additionally, their exclusion from decision making also renders them more vulnerable because a lot of the time their needs are not adequately met. So just because we have so little time, I've only kind of supplemented a very, very few amount of kind of how women are impacted by climate change, but the effects of climate change on women are multilateral, so they span across so many sectors. So I really invite you to explore these further, either if you want to visit the EmpoderaClima platform or just do some more general research. But yes, this is a very, not an extensive list, just because of the time constraints that we have. But in terms of agriculture, women produce the majority of the world's food. However, they only own about 20% of the world's titled land. So there's a huge discrepancy there. And although they have particular knowledge in ecosystem management and ecological linkages, in the midst of an environmental crisis or a change in agricultural patterns, there is gendered access to land and resources. So they do not have access to adequately respond to these, to environmental degradation. In terms of forestry is traditionally a male-dominated sector. However, it's heavily relied on by women, particularly Indigenous women, grassroots women, and rural women. And the majority of firewood collection and charcoal production is undertaken by women. However, they've got limited influence over forest rulemaking, which creates, I suppose, unequal corridors of power for them. And there's a huge kind of gap there. Who's actually undertaking the work and who's making the decisions. In terms of migration, I think especially in times like these, in kind of periods of uncertainty and being in this precarious situation of our current global situation, in times of stress, there is an increase of domestic violence. And we can see that with what's happening in the world at the moment. And that links to environmental destruction also in times of risk of unemployment, of migration, of when livelihoods are at risk, there is an increase of domestic violence and sexual and gender-based violence. In additionally, when other members of the household migrate and women stay, they often have to undertake additional roles, which burdens them further. And health. Climate change impacts health in a multitude of ways. It really threatens sexual and reproductive health rights. Fumes from environmental toxins threaten reproductive health rights. And in many circumstances, bodily autonomy and personal safety are threatened. Traditional cooking methods also contribute to a significant amount of deaths worldwide, more than tuberculosis and malaria combined. And because of these social norms, women undertake the majority of the cooking, meaning that they're disproportionately affected by this. Also, because women are the primary caregivers in society, there is a burden of mental health and psychological stress that comes with this loss of livelihood and unemployment that climate change threatens. So just in terms of gender and climate policy, so with the disproportionate effects of climate change, there's also inequality in climate action, with those who are most affected by climate change actually omitted from decision making. So despite this really unique knowledge that women possess because of the disproportionate impact that climate change has on them, they're regularly excluded from all political spheres really, and environmental decision making is included. So women have historically been underrepresented, which means their specific needs are not met. So as we can see from this graph that I got from the Women's Environment and Development Organization, it just shows a trajectory over the last 10 years of women's participation. So COP, for those who don't know, is the Conference of the Parties. It's one of the largest conferences on climate change, headed by the UNFCCC. But it shows that at COP15 in 2009, 10% of women were heads of delegation. Fast forward to the most recent COP in December, and 21% of heads of delegation were women. Now, I know this is an increase, but the increase has not been an upward trajectory. It's often decreased. For Paris in 2015, it decreased, and this year it's actually decreased from 2018. And so at this rate, gender parity for delegates won't be achieved until 2046, and that's even later for women to be heads of delegation. And we know that diversity in leadership leads to more well-informed policies and more sustainable climate action, because when you have more insight into these diverse perspectives and experiences, you're going to result in a more multifaceted approach and then thus more effective climate solutions. So despite the barriers women face, they're definitely paving the way in local and community-based climate solutions. These solutions come from lived experience, and really you can't create policies based on experiences that you have not lived. So these women are cultivating their own community-based and local initiatives, and providing alternatives for really effective and just climate solutions. So I just chose a few today because and you could get lost in looking at all these amazing initiatives taken by women, but I've just chosen a few and I've linked them if anyone wants to take a little look. But the Women's Weather Watch in Fiji, I think they were set up in 2009, but they monitor approaching storms and are really heavily involved in disaster management. The Pari Women's Development Association, they're leading reforestation efforts in Papua New Guinea, and the Women Climate Sathis in Bangladesh, who create solutions to make slums more adaptive to climate change. So all these are really, really amazing solutions to kind of, on a local level, to take climate action. So what needs to be done? This is definitely not an extensive list, and I invite anyone, if they want to add to this list, to type it in the chat to kind of make it a bit of a more interactive webinar. But this is just a very basic list. But sex and gender disaggregated data is really important to examine the differentiated impacts so that we can inform effective climate policy. Those who are impacted most should definitely be at the front line, and climate policy needs to examine how all of these vectors of inequality intersect and sustain one another, and allow that to shape climate policy and future climate policy. Gender mainstreaming in all areas of climate policy is really integral as well to achieve sustainable development goals, because, as I said, climate change has multilateral effects, and so gender mainstreaming needs to also be multilateral across these sectors. So we need it in adaptation, mitigation, disaster risk reduction, in climate finance, climate finance and education. We need an all-encompassing approach. And finally, we need more women in decision-making positions. Structural change comes from the bottom up, and we know that these structures have functioned to exclude women for decades. And so we really need to support a behavioural change. Women's participation, it can't just be tokenistic or a tick the box mechanism. It really has to come from a local, national and international level. And finally, just a final note, in recognising that climate justice is really impossible without the inclusion of Indigenous women, rural women and grassroots women. We need to incorporate women's rights into climate action so that we can ensure the enactment of the Sustainable Development Goals and derive Sustainable Development Goals for all. Those who suffer the most need to be at the forefront leading these climate policies. And there is no climate justice without gender justice, racial justice, disability rights, LGBTQI rights, because really we are only as strong as those around us. So yeah, thank you. That's me finished.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Shannon. Let me just get back to my screen. Can you stop sharing your screen? I can't do that for some reason. Okay, I think I got it. Perfect. So thank you so much, Shannon, for that great presentation. As I mentioned before, the idea was to really have this introductory presentation about gender and climate, just because, you know, even though EmpoderaClima has been doing that kind of work for almost a year, and I personally have been doing that work for almost 5 years now, it is something that people always ask me, and always asks a lot of us that are here that are experts in gender and climate justice. It's a very simple analogy, I would say. It's a very simple understanding of why women are the most vulnerable to climate change, but also why they can be the biggest leaders in climate action in national governments, at the UN, at the local level. So there's a bunch of different spaces where we can raise the voices of women, especially women from the Global South, to speak their minds and really develop nature-based solutions and climate-based solutions that are beneficial for our planet. So we hope that this presentation was helpful in that, but of course, as I mentioned before, we do have a lot of the content on the website that focuses on that. And we have fun content like podcasts and videos that really helps understand that concept of gender justice and climate justice. So definitely check it out later. And now, so we don't lose too much time, I'm gonna pass the word to Tetet. I introduced her before, and we're really, really excited to have her as our keynote guest on this webinar, all the way from the Philippines. We know it's super early for you, but it's such a pleasure to have you here on this webinar to talk a little bit about systemic change, climate justice, and COVID-19. So you have the floor.
Okay, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone. Thank you very much for having me here at this webinar. And I hope that we would be having a good conversation. No? So I wanted to do a PowerPoint presentation originally, but then I said, no, we've been having way too many webinars already, and let's just have a real conversation. And I wanted to try and provoke everyone. And let's see, no? And I'm so happy for Shannon for her presentation earlier. And I'm super happy because her last slide was about the Women's Global Strike, which I also coordinated, no? So those are the connections that we're already seeing, no? So I think let's start off by saying that this is probably the most meaningful Earth Day observance that we're ever going to have. No? So for this year, we observed the 50th anniversary of the Earth Day. And I think there's really very little to celebrate for this Earth Day, but a lot of lessons to be learned, not just observed for this year. Now, because for now, we are really seeing that the climate crisis and the pandemic are in sharp focus. Now, so in terms of the relation of women to COVID-19, we already know so much about it. We've read and seen, you know, that majority of health and the social care work is performed by women. Majority of care work, both paid and unpaid, is also performed by women. And in terms of the many challenges and difficulties that we face during these times of COVID, for many women, especially in the global south, physical distancing, you know, is not an option for everyone. And so we have a lot of women who are more exposed to situations of abuse, you know, at home, especially during these crisis times. And really, policy measures that governments will undertake must look at the differentiated needs of women and men in these times. So I've been doing a lot of writing and thinking because there's so many things. Now, I'm sure everyone is so insecure. A lot of uncertainties if we can even imagine a post-COVID future. But let me just say that, you know, there are three main things that we can observe. I don't want to say that we've learned the lessons already because events are still unfolding. So perhaps, you know, some food for reflection about what this crisis is teaching us. Okay, so the first, what we see now is that scaled up international mobilization is possible. Now, we've seen many governments, many international agencies are taking a lot of unprecedented action in the last month or so. And it brings us into this realization that rapid action is important before the problem becomes too big or too late to handle. It was in January or maybe in December even that the alarm bells on this new virus have been sounded off. But it was only in March when the World Health Organization officially declared it a global pandemic. So I don't know if it's because some governments still try to downplay the threats that this virus brings, or, you know, there's a general aversion to preparing for a disaster. But what we've seen lately is that many governments belatedly adhered to the precautionary principle, which says that it is better to err on the side of caution, especially where it concerns areas that we're not really sure of, such as the effects of this pandemic. So a lot of governments now have enforced lockdowns. Borders have been closed, schools shut down, work has been shut down. But amid all of these lockdowns, there is still a general inadequacy of health and relief measures, which now leads to many, many discussions and criticisms of the effectiveness of this militarist approach. Lots of rights are being violated. And for instance, in the Philippines, we're already in our 38th day of lockdown, and still no mass testing is being done. A lot of our health workers are getting infected, and so many of our poor homeless people are violating this lockdown enforcements because there are no relief measures being given to them by government. So if people are hungry, then you would really try to find ways to provide food for your family. So in relation to climate, we're saying that it's possible, massive political mobilization is possible. But isn't it that it was only last year when millions of people all over the world started going out and calling out the inaction of many governments on the climate emergency? But still, it's business as usual with massive burning of fossil fuels. Governments are forever locked in negotiations. And just last year, the 25th anniversary of the climate negotiations, governments are still talking about market solutions to the climate crisis, when in fact it's the markets who have brought us into such mess in the first place. So that's one lesson that we need to really seriously reflect on. It's possible, but why isn't it happening for climate justice? Second lesson that we probably need to highlight in all of these things is that what is happening right now, it's not science fiction anymore. Now, the COVID is not a natural disaster. It happened because of human activities. It happened because of the massive destruction of ecosystems, clearing away forest lands for monocrop plantations. So many times we've been hearing that agriculture is the main cause for climate change, but we have to nuance that. It's not agriculture as practiced by the small farmers or the small farm workers, because for centuries now, indigenous people, small farm workers have been caring for the environment with sustainable farming methods. What is not highlighted here is the role of corporate agriculture, the massive use of pesticides, fertilizers, unsustainable farming practices, so that corporate agriculture can profit even more from agriculture. So this is one virus. I'm not downplaying the impacts, the havoc that COVID-19 is bringing to everyone. But really, this is our future playing out before our very eyes if climate change is not going to be addressed. We're seeing that glaciers are melting, permafrost are thawing out, and researchers have been discovering, a lot of virus groups underneath those glaciers, underneath those permafrost. And we're totally unprepared for that. So this is a taste of what will happen if climate change is not seriously addressed. because already we are shocked at more than 2 million people infected, hundreds of thousands are dead from COVID-19. But with climate change, in the last 10 years of extreme weather, climate disasters, more than 500,000 people have already died. And just last year, there are 17.2 million newly displaced people because of climate impacts. These are the climate migrants, usually people whose lives and livelihoods have been lost and damaged forever because of the impacts of climate change. Storms are becoming stronger, droughts are becoming more severe, there are no more options for their livelihood. So they are forced to be displaced from their communities. And we're seeing that this pandemic could actually be a ticking time bomb for climate migrants and refugees who are stuck in borders with nowhere to go. With governments closing down their borders, I don't want to even begin thinking about it. No? The third point I'd like to highlight now is that a lot of people are saying there's a collateral benefit for the environment, in terms of decreases in carbon emission. Look, the skies are becoming clear. Look, the swans in Venice Canal have returned, which, by the way, have been proven to be fake news and fake posts that have been reposted many times over. There are also those who would like to think that COVID-19 is like a detox. No, it's a vaccine of the earth for all the destruction that human activities have brought about. But I think it's really twisted and warped at so many levels to think that this is all good. No, because lots of people are dying. The economies are collapsing, people's livelihoods are affected, savings, etc. Human rights are being violated. I understand that people would like to look for silver linings, especially during this time. But really, I don't think there's a lot to rejoice about in the face of so much human suffering. If any, COVID actually magnifies the inequalities that were already present in normal times. I don't know, but the normal was actually a situation of multiple crises, social, economic, political, climate crisis. And now COVID is bringing it into sharp focus. So I don't know if this is the normal that we would want to return to. What we're saying now, of course, we have a right to imagine our future, and we should work for our future. And the UN Secretary General has been sounding of humanitarian appeals, so that the world can recover better. Actually, it's a good call, but I don't know, how to do that. Right now, we're hearing flatten the curve. It's a first response. Yes, we need to slow down the spread of the disease. And if you think about it, current mitigation and adaptation efforts for climate, that is also a first response. It is a needed first response, but it is inadequate because it doesn't respond to the fundamental issue why we are vulnerable and unprepared both for COVID and even for climate crisis. So what we're saying now is that quote unquote, we're back in business approach will not work. It never has, and it never will. Now, for the longest time, climate activists have been calling for systemic changes away from the fixation over economic growth, away from models of quote-unquote development that focuses on extraction, more production, more consumption, that really highlights the failures of this system, the system that has benefited the few, the elite, a system that has commodified nature,
putting a price tag, no, on everything in nature, a system that has embedded deep inequalities between and among countries, between and among women and men, between different races, genders, classes, a system that has benefited the fossil fuel and extractive industries. So there are already a lot of alternatives, no? They go by different labels. Some would call it just transition. Some would call it a global Green New Deal. Others, feminists would want it to be a feminist Green New Deal. In Latin America, I know that alternatives calling for buen vivir, no, which is living well, which is different. No, living well, which is different from being well off under the capitalist framework. So many alternatives already exist that emphasizes solidarity, regeneration, equity. So perhaps now is the time that we should all be pushing for this out-of-the-box alternatives, because really, the normal was a situation of crisis, and certainly if we want to have a shot at the future, then we should not be going back to this normal, which is crisis upon crisis upon crisis. So I'd love to hear what you think about it, and come on, let's try to think outside the box. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tetet. That was very enlightening, very inspiring. And I also added to the chat the article that you wrote recently called The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, Climate Justice in the Pandemic. So if the people here on the webinar want to know more about what she just presented on, you can just click on the link. And right now we're going to move to some Q&A. We have about 15 minutes left of this webinar, but as Tetet mentioned, we definitely want to have a conversation and talk about how we can, achieve climate justice in this weird times that we're facing in times of COVID-19. As Tetet mentioned, it's important for us to be careful when we celebrate the positive effects of COVID-19, or celebrate is a bad word, but when we think about those positive effects to the environment, because it's about so much more than that, and we're going through this public health crisis, so that must be our priority at the moment. And it's also important to think, when people say, when are we going back to normal? What is the new normal? So it's just some food for thought that I would like to give to the participants. But we do have some questions on the chat. So I'm gonna read the first one by Swarnima from India. Her question is, how is climate change affecting women's sexual, reproductive, and mental health? Many environmental toxins are endocrine disruptors, as research shows, and women are disproportionately affected. What's the way forward? That is a great question. Could I pass to Shannon to answer this? And then Tetet, if you want to add.
Hi. Yeah, that's a great question. And I think it's one that's very important, particularly regarding our current situation. We've seen certain medical services being suspended in many places, and with travel bans, many women they can no longer travel to avail of certain services that they need, which in my opinion has really shown us that when disaster strikes, reproductive rights are the first things to go, which is really alarming, because with the looming threat of climate change, government's reaction, when a disaster strikes is going to be the same. So that's one thing that's really, really opened my eyes during the current global situation. But yes, environmental toxins and hormone disruptors definitely interferes with reproductive functions, and it can affect male and female reproduction, and maybe even the health of future generations. And so I suppose what we need moving forward is, I think, more women at the table making these decisions so that we can ensure that their needs are adequately met. Sexual and reproductive health rights should be really integrated into climate resilience, so that there's I suppose so that we can deal with it on a local, national and international level. Obviously, there's different health rights for men and women. I know that there's a disproportionate effect of psychological stress. And with the threat of unemployment and migration, there's just risk of trafficking for women and a gateway into involuntary sex work. And so we need more women at the table making decisions so that we can address these mental health inequalities and sexual and reproductive health inequalities, including them within the NDCs, countries' national adaptation plans is very important. But yeah, so just more women participating and making these issues known, I think. And if Tetet wants to add on that, because I'm sure she has really valuable information also.
Great, thank you, Shannon. Do you have anything to add, Tetet? Or should we move to the next question?
Well, I'd just like to be a little bit controversial. Yeah. In the climate negotiations, I'm sure you've been there several times already. Of course, women and gender advocates have been calling for, more women's participation in decision making. But I don't know, I just want to pick everyone's brains right now. I don't know if having more women with the same capitalist framework, extractivist thinking would actually do more. I think it's more harmful to have women with this kind of very capitalistic framework. You get what I'm saying, no? It's like we need women who are actually feminists. We need women who are thinking structural analysis, no? It's not just a tokenistic representation that just because you're a woman, you're expected to be, a feminist, progressive, etc., etc. On the other hand, it could even be more damaging if you have strong women on the table, but with a very dangerous patriarch or capitalist mindset, no? Just a food for thought again.
Great, thank you so much. I would love to comment more on this, but we do have a lot of amazing questions, so I'm just going to move on to the next one. So Lucia Rodriguez from Argentina asks, do you know any country that has taken any COVID-19 policy with a gender perspective? For example, Peru has done the exact opposite by letting women and men out on different days. The supermarkets were collapsed on Women's Day. I mean, my personal comment on that is I don't know if everyone here saw, we recently shared an article on EmpoderaClima's social media, which is about how the countries that have women leaders actually have had the best solution so far to COVID-19 or have taken action earlier, basically. So I think that article was about the Prime Minister of New Zealand, the Taiwanese president, German Chancellor, basically the countries that have contained COVID-19 the fastest or earlier are led by women. So it's quite interesting to see that dynamic, how female leadership and women's empowerment plays a role, not just in climate justice and climate action, which is our main topic here, but also in solving or acting on public health crisis that we're facing. So Shannon or Tetet, do you have anything to add on that? No? Okay, perfect. So I guess I know that doesn't really answer your question because I know that there's probably countries with a gender perspective on COVID-19, but what I mentioned is I do know that countries that have female leadership usually do better in that sense. And especially when we're talking about climate also, we have some research published on EmpoderaClima website that says that the countries that have more women in power or more women in Congress or just decision-making contexts, they have more friendly environmental agreements or they sign more climate-related agreements. So it's quite interesting to see how that dynamic plays out. Okay, let me go to there's a question specifically for Tetet, so I'm going to go to that one. It's from Kezia. Please forgive me if I pronounce everything wrong on this, but I will try. I'm Kezia. I grew up in Dumaguete City in the Philippines, and I advocate for indigenous women, particularly in the Subanan tribe in the Sibugay region affected by climate change. How do you think young leaders like us can cater to vulnerable communities in relation to the media? Are there resources, most especially in tackling the mental health and trauma? Is there any way that we are able to connect to you? And that question is for Tetet specifically.
Yeah, thanks for that question. Of course, I would love to connect with you. Perhaps after this webinar, we can exchange contact details. Yeah, but I think it would be great if young people can really maximize your creativity, your skills, your talent. You know, you're so savvy, you're so creative, and I think let's put that energy into good use. You know, if you're really good on social media, and I think in this time of physical distancing, people turn to social media. So let's try to strengthen our work around that area so we can reach more, you know, people who are also using these kinds of virtual platforms. So that's a challenge and an invitation. Instead of just doing TikTok and whatever, let's try to be more productive and engaging. All right?
Great, thank you so much, Tetet. I just typed this in the chat, but if you want to ask your question live, just because we have everyone's microphones able to be unmuted at any point, just type an X on the chat and we can do that. We have about 4 minutes left, so not too much time, unfortunately, but I'm going to read another question that came up while you think of any last ones to Shannon and Tetet. So this one says, hi, Renata, I'm from Brazil, from Renata Koch Alvarenga. In our country, Black women suffer more than white ones, for example, in many sectors of society, because of the structural social inequality. How can we include more of this group in this discussion of climate justice and call to action? And thank you so much, Andrea, for this really great question. It's definitely something that we ask ourselves a lot with our EmpoderaClima work. You know, how can we include more people? Because of course, you know, I'm from the global south, I'm from Brazil, but I'm not, you know, an indigenous person. I'm not suffering the impacts of climate change as badly as people who live in island states are. So, you know, how can we ensure that we are including other groups, not just, you know, myself, young women from the global south, but also, you know, women from island states or indigenous women and indigenous girls, young women. So I think my take on that is that we need to try to make our privileges as accessible as possible and bring that knowledge to the people who maybe don't have a lot of access to them. So I know that personally, from my experience, I can say that you know, I've had a lot of privileged opportunities to attend global events and learn about climate justice in the past 5 years. And what I try to do is I try to translate that to my community, to my friends and family in Brazil. And, you know, one way that I do that is with EmpoderaClima, is bringing those articles to Portuguese, because of course you can't really expect people in the developing world to be fluent in English. That's not a thing. So, you know, by bridging that gap through language is one way we can do it. But of course, there's so many other ways, and I'm interested to hear other people's thoughts. Maybe we can talk later. I think you all have my email. But, you know, should we be going to schools? Should we be doing more work on social media? How can we actually approach those people that don't have maybe, you know, access to the internet or access to these high-level events, you know? And I think that's basically at the core of it. It's us using our privilege and our knowledge and, you know, what we've been able to receive in terms of content on climate justice and bring that to our local communities. That's why I said in the beginning, you know, let's try to take what we learned from here, so much from Shannon and Tetet, and bring that to, you know, our lunch table with our families, with our friends. So that's, I think, at the core for me, you know, education and raising awareness. I know, I'm aware I talked a lot. Let me see if there's any last questions. I know that Tetet gave her contact details. So you can definitely chat with her later if you have other questions. Do we have any last questions or maybe last comments from Shannon or Tetet?
Could you address the point that that Patricia brought up about addressing the immense inequality that affects Black population on the continent, and then looking at the death rate in Corona with Corona as well?
Yeah, definitely. I just saw that comment. That's a really hard question. I don't think I actually have a concrete answer for that. You know, as you know, I think Patricia, you're probably from Brazil as well, or from Latin America. You just as well as me probably know that, you know, especially in Brazil, we have a big inequality of, you know, race inequality, class inequality. So there's all kinds of things that affect us, you know, regardless of climate, regardless of climate solutions. So it's really hard to know how we can deal with that. But my approach, as I said before, is to try and bring education to Black communities, to those communities. But yeah, does someone has any other comments on influence on that could help? I know that Jessica just sent a link on the website, Jessica Olson. Do you want to mention anything on that, on racial dynamics? Okay, if not, it's on the chat, as you can see, and I can also share that later on our Facebook page or Instagram. So it's an article by the Sierra Club. For those that don't know, Jessica Olson leads the campaign for gender and climate at the Sierra Club. And there's an article about racial dynamics in the US and COVID-19 and gender and the health crisis. So I hope that helps. Yeah, I can hear you now. If you want to just mention.
Sorry, I was having a hard time getting off mute. This is Jessica Olson from the Sierra Club. Shared the link to the blog. Thanks, Patricia, for the really important question. I think the dynamics are really clear in the US, and it sounds like Brazil and other locations as well, that when we are fighting for climate justice, we have to consider all of the many other injustices that already exist. I think Tetet really drew out the economic injustices in particular, and the injustices in development as well. And so one of the things that I think a lot of climate justice advocates need to really do a lot better at is also advocating and fighting for racial justice. And as gender justice advocates and as climate justice advocates, it's our job and our duty to also realize that there are Black women, there are Indigenous women, there are women of color. And when we say women, we don't just mean white, privileged, upper class women who have the same mobility as a lot of people who attend the conferences and inform these conversations. So the blog I shared touches a little bit more on the US dynamics, but I think ultimately it's a much longer conversation. But thanks for letting me share a little bit of time. Thanks, Patricia, for the question.
Thank you so much, Jessica. And again, thanks, Patricia, for the question. And I agree, it's definitely a longer conversation. And unfortunately, we don't have time for that. But it's really important for us to think beyond what we have here, the representation that we have here, and try to be as inclusive as possible. And that includes, of course, Black women, Indigenous women, young women, the elderly, anyways, everyone. So I believe that's all the time we have. It's been about an hour. But really, thank you to everyone that signed up. We had over 100 people signed up to attend our webinar, which was really exciting and made us really happy, especially because EmpoderaClima is a new platform. It's just turning 1 year old this week. So it's really exciting to see this kind of support for our initiative and, of course, interest in climate justice and gender justice. And thank you, of course, to Shannon and Tetet for the wonderful presentations and your participation. As I said before, I know it's really late in Ireland and really early in the Philippines. So we really, really appreciate you being here and sharing your thoughts. Any last comments before we finish?
Happy anniversary and happy Earth Day, everyone. Let's keep fighting the good fight.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Tetet. And yeah, happy Earth Day to everyone. We do have amazing new content on Wednesday that we're launching, a big special surprise with EmpoderaClima. So definitely check us out. And this webinar is being recorded, so we will post it on YouTube. So if you couldn't stay here for the majority of the call, you can definitely check it out later or attend future webinars that we'll be hosting. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a great night. Bye-bye.